This video is about Jeff Cooper's scout rifle concept, aka his vision for a general purpose rifle mounted with a scout scope. The point of his idea is to have a light rifle that can be used to hunt most everything as well as be equally suited for fighting. The main difference between the scout rifle and most other rifles is the fact that it has a long eye relief scope mounted farther forward. Now, even if a rifle does not perfectly match Jeff Cooper's original specifications, it's still a scout rifle to me as long as it has a scout scope or is intended to use a scout scope. I'm not going to be overly concerned about Jeff Cooper's specifications, whether that's for weight or caliber, because most people want a rifle for themselves and they're not building it for Jeff Cooper. If you want to follow his words to the letter, though, and build a rifle that he'd like, go right ahead. I have nothing against that. Even though this 450 Bushmaster scout rifle has the scope missing, I still wanted to show it to you because I thought it was rather aesthetically pleasing. The reason why the scout rifle is called that is because one of the things it was intended to do is be suitable for military scouting, like Frederick Russell Burnham did during the Boer Wars. Now, when I think of a rifle that can do fighting as well as hunting, I don't think of a bolt action as Jeff Cooper did. The obvious reason is that someone with a semi-auto with higher capacity has far more firepower than someone with a bolt action. Jeff Cooper's opinion was that essentially a rifle's ability to provide rapid shots was irrelevant. He goes on to say that the purpose of a rifle is to provide a first-round hit, whether that's an animal or a human target. Then he says that having the ability to fire rapidly can detract from the point of the rifle by giving the shooter the impression that he can make up for a missed shot with a second shot. Obviously, this is outdated and backwards thinking. Backwards thinking is when you start with something like a belief and then you decide to find ways to justify that belief. In comparison, what you're supposed to do is look at the evidence without bias and draw a conclusion from it. So if every rifle was intended to make a first-round hit, and rapid fire was actually mostly irrelevant, as well as detracting from that goal, then semi-automatic rifles would have never been invented. His thoughts also closely resemble the old idea that U.S. forces should have stuck with single-shot pistols instead of using the more advanced Colt revolver. Way before Jeff Cooper's time, the thought process was that having multiple shots in a handgun would cause a soldier to waste ammunition. Even if some ammunition is wasted, ammunition is cheaper than lives lost due to being outgunned in a firefight. So unless you are a sniper, a bolt-action rifle has no place in modern warfare. This point is further driven home by the fact that no military officially used bolt-action scout rifles specifically for scouting purposes. Obviously, some soldiers somewhere will get their hands on scout rifles and use them, but it's telling that they weren't widely used by militaries for scouting. So in my opinion, the scout rifle really doesn't live up to its name. Military doctrine and what militaries want in a rifle were basically incompatible with what Jeff Cooper wanted in a scout rifle, which is somewhat strange because Jeff Cooper served in the Marine Corps, so he would understood how the military works and that scouting is not just a lone man going out into the field anymore, but rather a team effort. Even for scout snipers, you're not just going out there alone by yourself. Jeff Cooper had some reasons for wanting the scope so far forward, one of which was the balance of the rifle. Given that the vast majority of hunters use conventional scopes, I'm going to say that that specific concern for balance is not crucial to being able to hunt effectively. A couple other main reasons is having vision that is not obstructed by the scope, and the ability to easily load ammunition directly into the rifle. The need to load ammunition directly into the rifle is completely negated if you have a rifle that uses detachable box magazines, like the Steyr Scout does. For those of you who don't know, the Steyr Scout is built directly off of Jeff Cooper's ideas. A problem that I've noticed is the fact that so many hunting rifles have model-specific magazines. This means that spare magazines can be quite expensive and not interchangeable between rifles. So if you were Jeff Cooper and you were convincing a company like Steyr to make a rifle based off of your specifications because you have such great influence, you might have the foresight to make it based on the already available M14, AICS, or AR-10 magazines. However, this was a missed opportunity because the Steyr rifle was ultimately designed to use model-specific magazines like most others. Likewise, Jeff Cooper didn't mention anything to my knowledge about muzzle devices. A small light suppressor could be very useful for hunting, but I guess he didn't have the foresight to consider that. Ian McCollum made a video review of Richard Mann's book about scout rifles. In this video, he talks about how Richard did some tests, mostly speed and accuracy related, to compare the overall efficiency or effectiveness of the rifles. The results were that of the top 3 rifles, 2 of them had conventional scopes and 1 had iron sights. All of the rifles with scout scopes or pistol scopes were just not nearly as good. After talking with Steve Clifford, who knows Richard Mann, Steve says that Richard is really good at using iron sights, so this could explain some of why the iron-sighted rifle was faster than the scout scopes. It would also be fair to say that Richard has spent some time using scout rifles as well. So I would say that it's possible to have a scout scope equally as fast as a conventional scope if you put in the time building the skill. For most people though, a conventional 1 to 4 power scope probably would be faster than the scout scope, and some of that is due to the fact that so few scout scopes have the ability to go down to 1 power. I should also say that if scout scopes did have a noticeable advantage in speed, then all shooting sports competitors would logically be using them. So now that we have established that there are better rifles for military scouting than Jeff Cooper's scout rifle concept, how does his rifle compare to standard hunting rifles? Ron Spoomer interviewed Richard Mann, the author of the definitive book about scout rifles. Jeff Cooper, by the way, didn't actually write any books specifically about scout rifles. The highlight of this interview is when Ron asks Richard if there is any advantage in having a scout rifle over a conventional rifle, and Richard's answer is a simple no. Then Ron goes on to talk about how he really isn't interested in a scout rifle because of the small field of view that the long eye relief scopes give you. Then he restates the question, why would a hunter be interested in a scout rifle? Richard clarifies that there is no advantage to having a scout rifle over a conventional rifle. Jeff Cooper liked fixed power scopes with low magnification, but being stuck with low magnification and limited field of view is a problem, especially when you have a target that is somewhat obscured by brush, tall grass, shadows, or especially if there isn't a lot of light outside. This is the sort of situation that makes you realize that the more magnification and field of view you have helps you acquire the target faster, because human vision is inherently limited, which is why we have magnified scopes to begin with. The limitation of human vision is particularly a problem when you get older, or frankly your eyesight wasn't that good to begin with. This is a really good video that uses various scout scopes and conventional scopes and illustrates how in low light you need more magnification to see the same camouflage target. This would be a serious problem if all you have is a fixed 2.5 power scope on your rifle. I want to mention now Steve Clifford's experience with scout rifles. He started out in the early 1990s reading about Jeff Cooper's views on rifles in general, and so when he decided to get a rifle, he obviously wanted it to be a scout rifle because of what he had read. So he trained with it for years and hunted with it until he realized it was costing him opportunities to successfully harvest animals. Don here was interviewing Steve Clifford, and Don mentioned that he was having more success on a range in Oklahoma versus a more practical, uncontrolled environment in the Washington jungle because of the optical limitations of the scout scope. Steve Clifford goes on to explain that the scout scope is best used on a controlled range with known distances and very visible targets. Then he talks about the first time that he gave up on the scout rifle concept. He saw a deer through binoculars, then looked through his scope and realized that he couldn't see the deer at all because it had such a small field of view. He mentions that he passed up 1 or 2 shots because scout scopes don't do well in low light. Then he says that if you actually have to search for a target through the scope because you can't use your naked eye, then this is where the scout scope is at a huge disadvantage because of the very small field of view. Because of this incident, he gave up on the scout rifle concept for a while. He went back to the scout rifle concept with a loopholed VXR scope. The scope was then discontinued, and he eventually gave up on the scout rifle concept again because of its limitations, and he decided to go more towards a general purpose rifle concept. The point is that the Leupold had a larger ocular lens, shorter eye relief, and was mounted farther back. Steve said that this technically was not a scout scope because of the eye relief. So in my opinion, even at that time, he was beginning to move away from the scout rifle concept in order to gain practicality and greater effectiveness. Richard Mann explained that one of the reasons that the scope was so far forward was because Jeff Cooper wanted iron sights as well as a scope. Scopes back then weren't very durable, so you may not totally want to rely on one. So you had the choice of making the iron sights really high or moving the scope forward. However, there is another more modern solution to this problem, and it is offset iron sights. This is the setup that many soldiers and shooting sports competitors ended up using on their rifles, not scout scopes. Also, some ACOGs are equipped with very basic iron sights on the top of the scope or a red dot. I think the general consensus today is that having offset iron sights or an offset red dot is the preferred backup if your scope fails. There is also the option of making a stock that has an adjustable cheek piece or perhaps a removable piece so that you could have low iron sights mounted under the rifle scope. Now obviously Jeff Cooper didn't decide to pioneer some of these more innovative options that would allow the user to use standard scopes and enjoy a wider field of view. One of the reasons for this is because of his belief that having a scope mounted right in front of your face would cause problems. To Jeff Cooper, the point of the scope is to make target acquisition faster. To him, magnification would always be secondary to the fast sighting provided by a single focal plane. In my personal opinion, a scout scope with a large objective lens and the ability to go down to 1 power and provide a larger field of view would be better than other scout scopes. Jeff Cooper said that getting lost in the scope was mainly due to lack of proper technique. He also mentioned that having the scope too close to you and having too much magnification factored in as well. To him, the proper way to use a scope is to look at the target with your eyes and then mount the rifle so that it's pointing as close to the target as you can. Then, when you look through the scope, you'll see that the reticle is placed where you pointed the rifle. In comparison, he says that the improper technique is to take your eyes off the target and look through the telescope regardless of where it's pointed. Lack of proper technique is one way to put it, but it's not quite what I would call it. If you're in an era where some people have been using iron sights their whole lives and then they start to use scopes, I think that is more of a lack of familiarity with the scope that is causing the problem. I think it's inevitable that someone will get used to quickly using a scope if they have long enough to get familiar with it. If you look at it from this way, it's easy to understand why he decided to use scout scopes. Scout scopes are sort of unique compared to conventional scopes in the fact that when you look through it, your brain cancels out the body of the scope itself, so your vision is essentially normal except for the section that is magnified by the scope. Jeff Cooper goes on to say that the closer the scope is to your eye, the slower it is to use, and the more likely you are going to get lost in the scope. For a lot of people, that statement is a little confusing. However, when you look at it from the perspective of someone who is only used to using iron sights, you realize that scout scopes are in fact faster to use and harder to get lost in the scope than conventional scopes. This is because of their ability to make your brain basically ignore the scope body. So from this perspective, you could say that scout scopes are basically a crutch to help those people who know nothing but iron sights. One of Jeff Cooper's other criticisms of conventional scopes was the fact that they have a limited field of view. I consider this statement somewhat ironic because scout scopes have a smaller field of view than conventional scopes of the same magnification and lens size. His criticism can only make sense if you charitably interpret it to mean something like a fixed 2.5 power scout scope has a larger field of view than a 3 to 9 scope that is left at 9 power. But if you do a fair comparison between the two, turning the variable conventional scope down to 3 power, it has significantly more field of view than the 2.5 power scope. So for most scouting, hunting, and general purpose use, Jeff Cooper's scout rifle concept is not noticeably better than conventional scope designs, and it has some major limitations. With that said, I think the Scout Scope has one redeeming feature. It can successfully be used on some rifle designs like the SKS or Mosin Nagant that were never originally intended to have scopes on them. Obviously, both of these rifles use stripper clips, so even if you had an option to mount a conventional scope on them, you really wouldn't want to because that would totally destroy your ability to reload quickly using these clips. So from my more modern perspective, the true purpose of the Scout Scope is to make up for the lack of a rifle's ability to effectively use a conventional scope. The long eye relief German ZF41 1.5 power scope fits this definition well and predates Jeff Cooper's scout rifle concept. It was actually used in military service as well, and I would personally consider the ZF41 to be the first scout scope. In fact, Norway seems to have liked retrofitting guns to use scout rifle scopes for military use, as Ian McCollum talks about in his video. I believe that the existence of the ZF41 and the demand for long eye relief scopes on rifles like the Mosin Nagant is proof that even if Jeff Cooper had not popularized the scout rifle, long eye relief scopes would still exist. I also think that the brain's ability to ignore the scope body is really only an advantage when you are already looking through the scope and a target appears outside the view of the scope but close enough that you can see it with your regular vision. Maybe you could make the argument that if you're watching deer through your scope and waiting for a good shot, that this would be an advantage in helping you see a larger buck walk out of the brush some distance away. However, just how big of an advantage the scout scope is in that situation is still up for debate. Logically speaking, if a small scout scope mounted forward is the best option for unobstructed vision, a large conventional scope mounted back would be a really bad option. But when I look through a fairly large scope with a 50mm objective lens, I have no significant problem using my regular vision to see the world around me despite the large scope in front of me. The scope body is somewhat distracting, but I could only call a distraction, not a hindrance. That's a subjective opinion, though. I don't actually think that we can quantify this advantage, so it's ultimately up to personal opinion to determine how much value this advantage gives you personally. Most people aren't constantly looking down their scope the entire time they hunt for obvious reasons. Maybe this advantage would be larger if you had a rest that holds your rifle and you're up in your tree stand, pointing the rifle only in one direction because of very specific terrain, and that's the way you know the deer would be coming. I think the best use for a scout scope is on an urban sniping rifle in an overwatch position covering a street where you know enemies are going to eventually appear. In this situation, you would be looking down your sights the whole time because you're watching and waiting. You've also had time to get a good position, so you could keep holding your rifle without being fatigued because it's resting on an object. This situation is the only one that I can think of that a scout scope could be better than a standard low-powered variable optic or a red dot and magnifier combination. But we have to make the scenario even more specific to make the scout scope the obvious choice. There has to be some incentive for you to use a rifle that was not originally intended to use a scope. Even standard M14s can be retrofitted with scope mounts, so you can use a conventional scope. So you'd need to have something like an SKS or a Mosin Nagant retrofitted to use a scout scope mount. Both of these rifles use stripper clips, and you would not want to take away the ability to rapidly reload using clips. So in the situation that you are a soldier fighting an active war in a former Soviet nation that has a lot of SKS and Mosin Nagant still around in relatively good condition, and a real lack of accurized purpose-built rifles like SVDs, the scout scope would be the obvious choice for urban sniping. Likewise, it makes sense if the only rifle you own is something like an SKS or Mosin Nagant, and you would want to mount a scout scope on that to use for hunting. Obviously, you can mount a scope with shorter eye relief on an SKS or Mosin Nagant. It's just counterproductive to do so, in my opinion, when you could use a scout scope mounted farther forward so that there is no obstruction whatsoever to feeding the rifle. People will also make the argument that scout scopes made sense at the time. which is mostly valid because Jeff Cooper didn't predict how popular low-powered variable optics would become. 1 to 4 and 1 to 6 power scopes have essentially replaced scout scopes for most people who would want a fast, low magnification optic. Jeff Cooper preferred to have a fixed power scope because they were more durable than the more complex variable power scopes. That's a valid concern, but a lot of people were still choosing variable power conventional scopes over the fixed power scout scopes at this time. If variable scopes were breaking all the time, you'd think that people would realize that just buying another variable scope is probably a bad idea. So you can't really make the argument that scout scopes made more sense at the time due to unsophisticated scope technology. People today will also criticize scope manufacturers for not making scout scopes with the features they want, like high-density glass for example. What they may not realize is that the amount of scout scopes being sold is not enough to justify more investment into a new scope. As the saying goes, money talks. So if the demand for a new scope was enough to make a large profit, companies would obviously make the new scope to make more money. Further evidence for this is the fact that some scout scopes, like the 2.5 power Leupold, have been discontinued, and most scout scopes being sold today are budget optics. They aren't terribly expensive because the demand isn't there for premium scopes, because they are already a niche market. Going back to the idea that scout scopes made sense at the time, I want to do a bit of comparison. 3 to 9 by 40 conventional scopes were probably the most common kind of scope used for hunting across the years. If scout scopes were in fact better, then logically conventional scopes would have already been replaced by scout scopes. An example of large-scale replacement would be the fact that Glocks and other polymer striker-fired pistols have replaced revolvers in police use across the years, because Glocks and similar pistols are more suited for modern police use. A similar argument of it made sense at the time can also be made for the carrying handle on the AR-15. Some people would say that it made sense at the time. Well, yes, it made sense to the person who thought of it, but for most everyone else, we are asking the question, why would you bother to carry your rifle in a way that you cannot immediately use it? The answer, of course, is that it really didn't make sense, and that it was not a particularly useful feature. This is why so many AR-15s sold today don't have carrying handles. So scout rifles would only make sense at the time if you did not know about the disadvantages of the scout scope, and you were led to believe that the scout rifle was the way of the future by Jeff Cooper's writings. Other than that, you could only argue that they made sense as a crutch for people who have only known how to use iron sights. Given that scout scopes are not used for this specific purpose today, is a sign that they were never really needed for this goal. In my opinion, most people would put themselves at a disadvantage by using a scout scope over a conventional rifle and scope combination. I would certainly not recommend anyone use a scout scope instead of a conventional rifle, and I'm frankly astonished that the scout rifle has lasted as long as it has. It is a testament to people's willingness to believe that Jeff Cooper knew best for it to continue into the modern era where most scopes are durable enough that most people clearly don't need backup sights for regular hunting. I also wanted to mention that some people seem to think that scout scopes inherently have a tighter eye box compared to conventional scopes, and that's not really the case. The eye box is the amount of distance that you can move your head around, more specifically your eye, and still use the scope effectively. The reason people would think that scout rifles have less of an eye box is because they have the scope mounted the wrong distance away from their face. So if your scope has 9 inches of eye relief and you have it mounted 9.5 inches away from your eye, you might say something like, I can hardly see anything through this unless I get really close, so the eye box is terrible. Also related to the scout rifle is the 376 Steyr cartridge. This was based off of Jeff Cooper's ideas and was intended to be a cartridge that fits in a standard rifle action and meets arbitrary caliber and energy requirements needed for hunting dangerous game legally in Africa. These requirements were not Jeff Cooper's idea, by the way, they were made by the nations themselves. Ultimately, though, this cartridge never really caught on despite Jeff Cooper's popularity. Today, Steyr doesn't sell any rifles chambered in the 376 Steyr because of a lack of demand. The much more popular 375 Ruger has effectively replaced the 376 Steyr. Finally, I'd like to thank everyone who helped answer my questions for this video, including Don from On the Scout. I'd like to especially thank Steve Clifford for taking the time to talk to me. I'm going to put a link in the description or the pinned comment for this video so you can go check out his channel.